400 warbirds took off from carriers stretched across the vast Pacific sky that morning, and only a fraction ever made it back. June 19, 1944 was not just another day of battle. It was the kind of day that rewrote the very script of modern warfare, line by line, in smoke and steel. Most Americans remember the tragedy of Pearl Harbor. That name alone echoes like a warning shot in our collective memory, but almost no one recalls the 2 days when Japanese air power was practically erased from the skies. If Pearl Harbor ushered in the era of the infamous Zero, then what marked the twilight of its reign, wiped clean in just 48 hours? Captain Samuel "Sam" Colton knew from the moment his boots hit the flight deck that this bird was different. The stubby old Wildcat he used to fly felt like a gamble in comparison. Not enough firepower, not enough armor. The Zero could outclimb, outrun, and outmaneuver it with ease. But now, he was sitting in the cockpit of an F-6F Hellcat, and this machine wasn't playing by the old rules. This was the Hellcat 6, a beast with a pair of Browning .50 caliber machine guns tucked into each wing, and a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine snarling beneath the cowling. 2,000 horses waiting to break loose. The cockpit was armored, thick glass, reinforced steel, a steel womb designed to give a man like Sam a shot at making it home. The Wildcat was a placeholder. The Hellcat? This was destiny on wings. On Sam's wing was Travis Ortiz, a green kid with just 2 combat missions under his belt, but nerves so solid he could have been carved from granite. Above them flew Commander Mike Dalton, who had survived the hellfire skies over Guadalcanal, cheating death more than once. And keeping a watchful eye over all of them, leading the formation like a ghost from the past, was Major Walter Green, a grizzled veteran of Midway, who had seen carriers vanish beneath waves and friends consumed by fire. He swore this time would be different. Just 3 years earlier, the sky had belonged to the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero, a sleek, graceful killer, faster and more agile than anything the U.S. Navy could throw into the clouds. It could climb like a hawk and strike like lightning, and in every skirmish, American aircraft were left wanting. Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, the legend of the Zero was carved in the Pacific like scars on flesh. The American F-4F Wildcat tried to stand tall, but it was outclassed in nearly every way. Thin armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, underpowered guns. Every turn against a Zero was a death sentence. The only thing U.S. pilots could do was dive, fire, and pray they'd outrun the enemy's iron sight before becoming just another flaming wreck in the sea. Losses mounted. Planes fell, and worse, so did the men inside them. Boys barely out of flight school, thrown into the furnace and gone in minutes. But pain was a teacher, and the lesson stuck. Courage alone would not win this war. America needed more than bravery, it needed muscle. Let the numbers tell the story. The Zero, 331 miles per hour, 1,930-mile range, no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, unmatched in a turning radius. The Wildcat, around 320 miles per hour, 770-mile range, light armor, few guns, sluggish in a dogfight. Then came the Hellcat, top speed over 380 miles per hour, longer range, an armored cockpit, sealed fuel tanks, and 6.50 caliber machine guns that could shred a Zero in seconds. It wasn't built to dance, it was built to climb, to dive, to take a hit and keep fighting. The Wildcat was a stopgap, the Hellcat was the answer. The stage was set over the Marianas Islands, a string of tiny, sun-scorched dots scattered across the Pacific, but each one priceless in value. Whoever controlled those runways would hold the key to Japan's front door. From these airstrips, the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress could reach the heartland of the Japanese Empire. And on that cloudless morning, as the Hellcat screamed off the deck, the sky trembled. This wasn't just another mission. This was a turning point. Task Force 58 was the blade forged to slice through the skies. This wasn't just a fleet, it was a floating fortress of destruction. 7 full-sized aircraft carriers, 8 light carriers, a wall of 15 battleships and cruisers, dozens of destroyers, and nearly 900 aircraft, the vast majority of them the fearsome F-6F Hellcats. The force was organized into smaller strike units, 58.1 through 58.4, each one bristling with steel, firepower, and radar eyes that could see far beyond the horizon. They weren't just flying by instinct. This was a war machine built on planning and precision. Fighter direction centers manned by trained officers mapped out glowing plots across radar screens, dividing the sky into layers of interception zones. There were eyes everywhere, voices guiding fighters through headsets, layered combat air patrols rotating at different altitudes, high, mid, and low, like stacked shields waiting for the blow. For the first time in the Pacific Theater, America owned the sky. Not with raw courage alone, but with control, coordination, and systemized discipline. On the other side of the Philippine Sea, Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa was preparing his own storm. He had 9 aircraft carriers and nearly 400 planes between his decks and the airfields of Guam, Rota, Tinian, and Yap, another 300 land-based aircraft ready to strike. The numbers looked impressive on paper, but numbers mean nothing when they are piloted by kids. Many of Ozawa's aviators had logged barely 50 hours in the cockpit, fresh faces, trembling hands, and machines too delicate for the thunder they were about to face. Captain Sam Colton could feel it coming in his bones. This wasn't 1942. This wasn't the desperate early war when courage had to cover for everything America lacked. Now they had the tools, the training, and the tactics to turn the tide. By morning, the legend of the Zero would meet the cold reality of the Hellcat. Just before sunrise, radar operators lit up with incoming contacts, first dozens, then waves of hundreds. In the darkened command centers, officers drew glowing arcs across radar screens, breaking the sky into kill zones. Pilots were scrambled, squadrons launched in layers. One group flew high, another in the middle, and a third low. The mission was crystal clear: intercept and eliminate the enemy before they ever saw the fleet. This was the first time in the Pacific War that the U.S. Navy had full command of aerial warfare. Gone were the days of chaotic dogfights and lone wildcat pilots praying for backup. Now the Hellcats flew in coordinated teams, trained to precision. Each pair worked together, one attacking, one covering, and both guided by radar. They didn't dance with the Zeros anymore. They dove in from high altitude, struck hard, and shot back into the clouds. Boom and zoom, that was the strategy. The Japanese Zero, once the king of agility, couldn't keep up at the speeds these Hellcats carried into battle. It tried to pull them into turning duels, but at over 300 miles per hour, the control surfaces on the Zero locked up, and its grace turned to lead. The old tactics were useless now. Discipline had taken the place of daredevil instinct. America's system beat Japan's tradition. By the time the third and fourth waves of Japanese planes tried to make it through, it was already too late. Most never got close to seeing an American ship. Many of Ozawa's young pilots panicked and broke formation at the first sight of enemy fire. Dive bombers scattered into the wind. Torpedo planes dropped one by one before they even came into range. What was meant to be a coordinated attack collapsed into a tragic scramble. By midday, the Philippine Sea had become a graveyard of shattered wings, oil slicks, and burning fuel, stretching across miles. On June 19th, 395 Japanese planes were lost. Of those, 44 were confirmed downed by flak or accidents, and 22 were destroyed by American aircraft after failing to return. U.S. losses in the air, somewhere between 20 and 30. It wasn't just a victory, it was a massacre. This wasn't just a sky full of fire. The sea claimed its toll, too. The USS Albacore, an American submarine lurking in the depths, fired a torpedo into the Tai-Ho, the pride of Japan's carrier fleet. A sloppy damage control effort turned smoke into an uncontrollable firestorm. By noon, the carrier had vanished beneath the waves. Another sub, the USS Kavala, delivered a deadly salvo into the Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea. She exploded from the inside and followed her sister ship into the abyss. In just one brutal day, Japan lost not only hundreds of aircraft and most of its skilled pilots, it lost two of its finest carriers, including its flagship. Admiral Ozawa found himself cut off, watching his fleet crumble before his eyes. The reckoning wasn't coming anymore. It had already begun. By sunset, the sky had stilled to silence. 4 waves of enemy aircraft had tried to breach the shield. 4 waves had failed.
Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft had been lost in just one day. In contrast, American losses barely reached 30. Fires still burned on the ocean's surface, black oil flames licking the waves as survivors clung to life on rafts. That night, American aircraft carriers lit up their flight decks, risking exposure and ice buildup just to guide their exhausted pilots back home through the black void of the Pacific. Captain Sam Colton climbed out of his Hellcat, his hands trembling, not from cold, but from adrenaline and raw fear. The scent of burned oil and cordite clung to him like smoke. Around him, the deck crew was laughing, half from relief, half from shock. Day 1 was over, and the myth of the Zero had shattered like glass under boot heels. But the battle for the Marianas was far from finished. Sam knew it. Tomorrow, the hunters would become the hunted. On June 20th, the Japanese fleet was retreating westward, limping away from the disaster. Admiral Raymond Spruance now faced a brutal choice. He could stay put and continue shielding the ongoing invasion of Saipan, or he could gamble, send Task Force 58 on a long-range chase and finish what they had started. Admiral Mark Mitcher was all in. He pressed hard for an immediate strike. He believed a final blow could crush what was left of Japan's carrier air power. The enemy was bleeding, its pilots burned out, its decks broken. Just one more hammer strike, and the whole system could collapse. Spruance weighed the risks, measured the odds, and then gave the order. Task Force 58 turned west, steel monsters roaring to life, charging into the Philippine Sea like wolves scenting blood. This wasn't just an attack. It was a desperate gamble calculated with surgical precision. Hundreds of American planes launched from carriers at maximum range, pushing fuel tanks to their limits before even spotting the enemy. In the chaos that followed, they locked on to a single prize, the Japanese carrier Hiyo. The strike was swift and merciless. Bombs tore through her flight deck, torpedoes ripped her flanks open like wet paper. Within minutes, the proud carrier was burning from bow to stern, belching thick smoke into the sky like a funeral pyre. Before nightfall, she slipped beneath the waves. It was a dagger plunged into the last lung of Japan's shrinking naval air force. A successful hit, but it came at a terrifying cost. The American planes had flown too far. As they turned for home, fuel gauges dropped to 0. Some pilots were forced to ditch into the sea. Others radioed out final prayers as their engines coughed dry. And then, in an act almost unthinkable in wartime, Admiral Mitcher gave the order, "Turn on the lights." Across the blacked-out Pacific, American carriers flicked on their deck lights, transforming into glowing floating cities, beacons guiding their lost pilots home through darkness and death. Dozens of planes were lost. Some ran out of fuel just miles from safety, but hundreds of men were saved. That was what mattered most. By the end of those 2 ferocious days, the verdict was absolute. Japan had lost 3 carriers, Tai-O, Shokaku, and Hiyo, along with somewhere between 500 and 600 aircraft. More than that,
They had lost the last experienced air crews their Navy could afford to sacrifice. The United States, in comparison, had lost 123 aircraft, the majority not to enemy fire, but to empty fuel tanks. The truth could no longer be denied. The Imperial Japanese carrier force wasn't damaged, it wasn't weakened, it had been wiped off the map as an effective weapon. The sky over the Pacific no longer belonged to the graceful Zero. It now belonged to the Hellcat and to the system that trained, armed, and supported it. This wasn't just the triumph of a single plane. It was the triumph of radar, of fighter control, of an industrial machine that never slept. This was a war won by systems. Discipline in the air turned rookies into lethal predators. Logistics kept the fuel, bullets, and spare parts flowing across thousands of miles of ocean. And above all, it was American industry, the relentless beast behind the war front, that made it all possible. Factories back home could build thousands of Hellcats every single month. Japan, barely a few hundred in that same span. One side built an ecosystem, the other built a legend. By war's end, the Hellcat would be credited with over 5,000 kills, boasting a kill ratio of 19-1, one of the most lopsided in aviation history. But numbers only tell part of the story. The true legacy of the Hellcat is that in modern warfare, systems beat myths. Mass production beat individual skill. Training crushed gut instinct. Adaptation defeated legacy. The Zero began the war as a ghost, untouchable, elegant, deadly. By June 1944, it was a relic scattered over the Marianas. The B-29 superfortress would rise next, carrying the war all the way to the Japanese homeland. That was the purpose of these islands. That was the meaning of Operation Turkey Shoot. The Hellcat wasn't a miracle plane. It was something greater, a symbol of adaptation, steel, and a nation that learned how to evolve faster than its enemies. The myth of the Zero died here. The future belonged to the system. And that system, it was unstoppable.